Forest Service, Northern Research Station. He's stationed at the Silas Little Experimental Forest in the New Jersey Pinelands. Mike obtained his PhD from the Rutgers Ecology and Evolution graduate program and has over 10 years of experience as a wildland firefighter, working with wildfires and prescribed fires in over a dozen states from Florida to Alaska. His early work was on remote sensing to predict forest productivity and disturbance impacts. He's now working on integrating fine-scale spatial measurements of forest vegetation, wind, and fire to better understand the mechanics of fire behavior and effects. So today, Mike will talk about the effects of fire on ticks. So, Mike.
Thanks, Cesar. So, as you might have guessed from Cesar's introduction, I'm talking a little bit outside of my typical vein of research today about ticks. I'm not a tick expert. I'm a forest ecologist and a fire ecologist who's stumbled into the exciting world of ticks. So this talk is framed around a review paper that we're about to resubmit that was in review, and a field study that we were working on to examine the question of, can the restoration of fire-dependent landscapes reduce problems that we have with ticks? And I'd just like to introduce my team real quick. This work involves my partner at Penn State, Jesse Cry, and future PhD student in the E&E program, Lexi Everland, and then Julia DeFeo is a Rutgers Camden undergraduate. Nathaniel Schmidt was at Penn State. Jeremy Weber from New Jersey Forest Fire Service, Nick Skronsky. And I am embarrassed that I did not make, Andrea Giese has also been an important part, and I failed to put her name on there, but she's been an important part of this project as well. So what I normally think about is a scene like this, how fire and vegetation interact. This is a picture of a growing season prescribed fire in the New Jersey Pine Barrens. And the things that I think about are how the vegetation structure and the moisture of the vegetation and the leaf litter interact with fire to create different characters of fire behavior that result in different fire effects. So in this scene, you can see we've got a lot of wet green leaves. At different times of year, those leaves will have different moisture contents, and depending on whether or not they have leaves on them, will impact how they behave as fuels, how much shade they cast on the forest floor, and how they moderate the microclimate. Basically, when we do a prescribed burn, we're eliminating about 2/3 of the leaf litter at the forest floor. And if we burn more and more over time, we'll reduce a little bit more each time we burn. We also can impact the forest structure in terms of shrubs and the canopy, and different magnitudes of fire behavior will have differential effects on what those forest canopy structures look like afterwards. This map on the left here highlights areas of Penn State Forest in the Pine Barrens that burned with different severities in a large prescribed fire project, and that wing sticking up off the top was actually a wildfire that occurred during the prescribed burning work. The bright yellow areas had the greatest effect, and the blue and purple areas had the lowest effect. And those colors don't relate exactly to this bar chart on the left, sorry, on the right. But basically, these bars represent different types of forest structure before the fire in figure A, and in B, how those different shapes changed after the fire because of the fire. So we're talking about basically the shape or the profile of the forest vegetation. Another way to look at that might be this figure on the left here. where we're seeing how different types of fire produce divergent outcomes for forest structure. Prescribed fire over time will elevate the canopy and reduce the mid-story and lower the shrub level, creating a big gap in the forest. Whereas repeated wildfire will reduce the overall height of the forest, creating a very dense, scrubby, approaching impenetrable thicket of trees and shrubs that are all jammed up together. And this impacts, basically these trends impact forest height, they impact forest density, and the distribution of material throughout the forest profile. And what I do is I do work with engineers and other ecologists to conduct multiple scales of experiments, such as the fuel particle scale, which would be a pine needle or a single piece of wood, all the way up to large scale field experiments where we're burning tens of acres at a time and examining these different processes using different sensors and different measurements. And fire is definitely a multi-scaled phenomena, and different things happen at different scales, and moisture and structure vary at different scales, at multiple scales at the same time. So we integrate that into fire behavior models, and this is a two-dimensional rendering of a fire spread prediction on the right here. This is a physics-based model, which is different than the traditional models that are more empirical. And this is sort of the way of the future, because it can represent different aspects of fire growth. And we can also look at how ignitions vary fire effects too, with these models, and how ignitions and forest structure impact flow. So this is just a little video of a prescribed fire. This is one that I worked on at the Albany Pine Bush Preserve in the city of Albany, New York, a couple of years ago. And it's interesting to see how the fire is doing different things at different points in this burn. It's creeping along in some places. You've got large flames in other places, and you can observe a little bit of how the flow might differ. So we're getting towards ticks here, don't worry. Over the past 100 years, especially, there's been a great decline in fire in our eastern landscapes. These two figures are of Maine and New Hampshire and New Jersey, and illustrate this decline over this time period. There's approximately a change that's about 2 orders of magnitude, 1.5 to 2 orders of magnitude in the area burned annually throughout our regions. And this is a map from Mike Stambaugh down at University of Missouri. But this map was created with many thousands of tree ring cores that examined the fire frequency throughout the United States. And you can see the East Coast, if you look at I know it's a little blurry, but much of the East Coast burned roughly at a 2 to 15-year rotation, excluding some parts of the Appalachians and when you get a little bit farther north of us in New Jersey. Presently, much of the East Coast only burns once every 50 years or less. So bringing this back to ticks, there's a number of historic anecdotes, I'll call them, that allude to the use of fire to reduce ticks prior to our current time. The first Andrea shared with us was Peter Kalm's notation of ticks in the colony of New Sweden. So in the mid-1700s, Peter Kalm was a prominent ecologist. He's who Kalmia, the genus, is named for. And he wrote about ticks at the Delaware Bay shore of New Jersey, essentially, what was then called New Sweden, and how fire basically was made illegal. And after that, the colonists were complaining that all the ticks came back, that they hadn't had a problem with them when they were allowed to burn. There's another paper publication from the 1940s called Our Pappies Burn the Woods, and it's a bit of a derogatory paper in today's terms. It was published in a journal actually by the Forest Service in the 40s. But one of the interesting things was that the folks interviewed in this paper described burning their forests to reduce ticks. And then Herbert Stoddard, the prominent ecologist who worked a lot with bobwhite quail in Florida, he also wrote in his memoir about burning to reduce ticks in Florida in the early 1900s. So in addition to the fact that fires changed and ticks have definitely increased in the past 100 years, there's also some other changes that should be considered. The white-tailed deer around the points that, around the early 1900s was practically exterminated from the United States. There was no hunting allowed. In Pennsylvania, the deer population recovered by the 1950s, and that was considered a monumental success and an example of deer management. But deer are important for tick movement and in the cycles of some tick-borne diseases. And so around the 1900s, there were a lot of different things that were less favorable to deer populations, let's say that have changed dramatically, aside from development and aside from some other factors that we talk about a lot, not to exclude them as being important, but so in the past 2 decades or so, the number of reported tick cases have really been skyrocketing, and there's been a much greater awareness of tick-borne diseases in the United States. There's presently about 17 or so, depending on what list you look at, tick-borne diseases. There's a few new ones that are gaining some recognition that are vectored by about 6 or 7 different tick species. And in the Northeast, we have a number of them, and some of them aren't as prevalent among people, but have been seen in wildlife. And so probably most importantly in New Jersey, we have the black-legged tick, the Lone Star tick, and the dog tick. And those are probably the most important from a medical sense. And these are some of the different diseases that they can vector to humans. And if you're not convinced that this is a good place to study ticks yet, which I probably didn't have to convince anyone of, we're pretty well centrally located in where the problem is, being in New Jersey. So when we think about fire and ticks, it's important to consider the life cycle of ticks first. The ticks in New Jersey have a 3-part life cycle where they go from the larval stage to the nymph stage to the adult stage, and the eggs have to survive too. And so at each of those stages, ticks are basically trying to do mostly 2 things. They're trying to get a blood meal to move on to their next life cycle stage, but they're also trying to stay hydrated. And that is an important factor when it comes to fire, because fire changes the environmental characteristics of the forest, changes the structure of the plant material that they climb on, that they seek refuge in, and it also changes the behavioral patterns of their hosts. Here's a conceptual diagram just showing how fire can impact many different aspects of the tick life cycle. It's a little bit busy, but fire's in the middle. And if you look down at the bottom left, we can think about how tick habitat is impacted by fire by altering soil, microclimate, and vegetation conditions. This in turn impacts the host and predator relationships of ticks, what other arthropods are hanging around them, which of their hosts are using the sites, and maybe how the host behavior changes given the change in forest conditions. And these things feed back into tick population sizes along with fire, which can directly just burn ticks. And I haven't mentioned that, but I'm not sure that's even the most important effect of fire. And then these things all will then feed back into the rates of transmission of parasites and pathogens. So we conducted a study, or we're still conducting the study, to look at how does dormant season fire impact ticks, their populations, the disease prevalence, and their habitat in the pine barrens. So we set up a project across an area of about 20 by 15 miles in Burlington and Ocean counties, located centrally in the New Jersey Pine Barrens. And each of these dots on the maps represents an unburned or burned site in our study where we sampled ticks. Each of the burned areas was burned in 2019. And the unburned areas were fire excluded for at least a decade or longer. So we only looked at places as far as ones that were burned that had been burned in the spring of 2019, only looking at that dormant season fire condition. And we collected our ticks in these plots in the upper right-hand corner of the screen using 7.3 meter transects. And so we went out in June, early June, around the edge of July and August, and then in early October to sample these plots. And we sampled, on days that it wasn't rainy, days that were fairly similar in temperature, at least within that given month period. And we used drags and sweeps to sample these ticks. So we've got these different directions laid out with bearings on this plot diagram in the upper right. And so on each day we sampled, we would walk we'd walk 3 separate transects. We'd walk out one side of it doing a sweep, and we'd walk back the other side of it doing the drag. And we do that 3 times, and then we'd sample 3 days. So each day that we sampled, we'd rotate our bearings by about 20 or 30 degrees and sample again. So we weren't covering the same areas, we weren't trampling the same areas, and we would do that 3 times and then wait 2 months between sampling. We collected all of our ticks with a lint roller and brought them back to the lab. I don't have a slide on that. And then we separated them, and we saved all of our ticks that we caught. And we've identified nearly all of them at this point. We're well into 2020. And because we're not tick experts, I feel pretty good about our identification. But since sharing data is an important thing, we've photographed every one of our ticks that we've caught, which we're kind of interested in potentially doing maybe some machine learning image analysis on them afterwards too. We also considered that not all fire burns the same. And so we have within our burned areas, we have an even representation of low, high, that should be moderate, and high severity plots that had different levels of effect from burning. This is just a slide about our sample timing and when ticks are thought to be most active during the year in New Jersey. So like I said, we brought all of our ticks back to the lab, and we cataloged all of them. This is a picture of Nathan, one of the students working on this project, identifying and photographing the ticks. And then we sent them up to the Center for Vector Biology in New Brunswick, and Andrea helped us conduct some PCR analysis on these ticks that we found to look at how maybe their disease burden would differ between burned and unburned areas. We also measured vegetation and microclimate in each of these sites. We looked at the stand density. We measured the shrubs, shrub height. We measured the litter depth and the duff depth. And then we also used these autonomous DigiSense hemp RH sensors to measure, to sample temperature every 5 minutes throughout actually the past 2 years at all of our sites. And I'd like to point out that we did a sample rather than an average because it's really easy to miss the resolution of peaks in temperature when you start to integrate over too long a time period. And particularly with sun flecks and things like that in the forest, we felt this was a good way to go. We also used LiDAR, a BLK 360, which is this thing that looks like a coffee can on top of a tripod in the middle picture, to also measure the greater forest structure. And that can create a rendering like the one seen in the black figure here of the tree canopies and the forest floor, which can then be analyzed. So our results. Basically, we found a whole lot of Lone Star ticks, Amblyomma americanum. They amounted to over 95% of our ticks in the first year, and as well in the second year. We also only found a very small number of Xodes, and a number of them were larvae, so we're not positive that they're scapularis, but yeah, there were, I think, out of about 4,500 ticks in 2019, I think we found roughly around 25 Xodes of any life cycle stage. And in 2020, we only found 6 out of about 3,600 total samples. So we focused the rest of our work really on Amblyomma because that's what we had the most samples of. I'll also point out that we only found Xodes, the ones that we did find were only found in the unburned fire excluded sites. So in 2019, well, we've looked at our data in 2 different ways. We looked at the probability of encountering 1 or more ticks in a site, and then we also looked at how many ticks there actually were. Because sometimes we would come across a number of ticks, but only once, and then other times there'd be none. And so basically in 2019, the probability of encountering 1 or more Amblyomma was much greater in the fire excluded areas, the green bars, than the burned areas. And while that wasn't, the difference wasn't significant, we're just kind of getting through this data, so I rushed to put this together and don't have error bars on here. But I did some significance testing, and that difference was significant for the adults in June and the larvae in October. You know, it wasn't quite significant in the other months for the other life cycle stages, but we did see a consistent trend there. The trend is pretty similar again in 2020. And one of the things I'd like to point out is that this reduction, yeah, basically that this was pretty similar through each life cycle stage throughout the year. This is what I wanted to point out. This is where we get to the quantity of ticks that we were finding. In August and October, you can see that we found a lot more ticks. That was larvae, and that's pretty common to find lots of larvae and fewer nymphs and adults. And that's because just most larvae don't survive. So for June and the July-August period, we found a reduction in adults and nymphs. There was a small reduction of larvae in August. And then in October, there was a great increase in larvae in the burned areas. And that had me concerned because I thought, oh no, what if there's a short-term decrease that then produces some big population bust? But if we go forward to 2020, we can see that apparently those larvae didn't make it through the winter because the numbers for June and July remain pretty low for adults and nymphs. And again, we see that same pattern with more larvae in October, which I think just means that they're dropping off, the adults that are going to lay eggs are dropping off of other animals in these burned areas, and they're laying their eggs, and it's pointless for them. I don't think they're making it through the winter. So just to sort of summarize this in terms of percent difference from unburned areas, we're seeing about a 50+% reduction in ticks where there have been burns. And this does depend on your life cycle stage, but more or less it's about 50% or so. And the exception is with larvae. And I'll also add that this bar in the middle, the yellow bar in the middle for larvae in October of 2019 actually was much more than 100%, but it made the graph kind of hard to interpret with the scale. So why might this be? Well, here's some differences in forest structure that can come from burning. This is about the most pronounced example I could think of, but basically where we've got annual burning and fire exclusion, you can really see a marked difference in forest structure. This is from 2 farms in the Pine Barrens that have done some work on. And you can see in the left pane of each figure that there's a much greater openness in the mid-story. The shrubs are much shorter, lower to the ground. They're maybe about knee-high. And with that, you get much more airflow. It dries faster. There's much more sunlight that makes it through. And also your species composition is a bit different. There's more herbaceous plants and less shrubs. Whereas you can see in these fire excluded areas, there's a much thicker mid-story, denser canopy, and you do get much less airflow through those areas and much less light at the forest floor. And those tend to stay cooler and damper by quite a bit. So at the forest floor, this precipitates some changes that I think might be important for ticks. Starting with the duff layer, or basically the indistinguishable organic material kind of between your leaf litter and your soil, is this thick layer. It's not always thick, of leaf mold in the Pine Barrens. And so we can see here that between burned and unburned sites, there's quite a big difference in the depth of that. Each of these differences here are significant. The leaf litter depth is much less. It's about 1/3 of that of an unburned area. And the shrub height also changes quite a bit. And the shrub height, I think, is important. I've read some literature, a number of papers about the importance of ticks getting to the desired height of their host body, which in multiple parts of the world has been found to typically be at whatever deer population lives in the area. And so if you think about it like this, we can go back to this page here. If ticks can climb up to that midsection of a deer really easily in these unburned areas, but in the burned areas, especially recently burned areas, the shrubs might only be ankle to knee high on a deer. And so, and there's much less of them. Their stems are spaced farther apart. They're shorter. And so there's a lot less surface area in contact with the deer's body than there would be in a excluded area. We also looked at temperature and humidity, as I mentioned, and we looked at this so far across our different severities of plots too. So there was an even number of different severities looked at in the burned areas. And what we found that was that as burn severity increases, or there's more of the forest that was involved in the fire, a high severity site would basically have some major canopy consumption. The canopy would have caught fire, whereas a low severity site would basically just be minor damage to the shrubs and some consumption of the leaf litter. And we can see that the average daytime temperatures and the maximum daytime temperatures in these sites are much greater where there were burns than where there weren't, especially where there were moderate and high severity treatments. You can see here that the maximum daytime temperature is about 15 degrees different between an unburned and high severity site. Relative humidity follows the opposite trend, which is what we'd expect. Sites that burned hotter and more severely had much lower relative humidities during the June. This is looking at the June to September period only. And these are also daytime values also. So basically it gets hotter and drier where you've had fires. Even a little bit of fire makes it hotter and drier. We also are a good deal of the way through our PCR component of the project that Andrea's been helping us with up at the Center for Vector Biology. And the results that we found aren't that surprising. The rates of infection in adults and nymphs are pretty standard, it seems like. I'll also point out that we have not found any Asian longhorn ticks in our study either. We didn't test the Ixodes scapularis, the deer ticks that we captured, because a number of them were larval ticks, and there just weren't really enough adults to make sense. We did not find a difference between burned and unburned sites. So there were fewer ticks in burned areas, but the rate of infection among ticks seems to be pretty similar still. So just to summarize, it seems like prescribed fire is generally reducing ticks. Now we've completed 2 growing seasons, and 2021 will be a 3rd season post-fire. It seems like clearly that Lone Star ticks are dominating in the Pine Barrens. And I guess we weren't totally surprised by how many Lone Star ticks we found, but we were surprised at how few black-legged ticks. And as part of another study, I have a student who was doing some pitfall traps in these sites to look at microarthropod effects. And she also has not found very many deer ticks. So I think that these differences are likely, more than just the direct impacts of heat from fire on ticks, but the change in tick habitat that impacts their life cycle strategies of trying to get a meal and retain moisture. So just to think about this, the comment has been made to me a couple times that, well, fire's not that big though. And I think I'd like to disagree with that here. You might not see it in New Brunswick, but prescribed fire actually amounts for about, it's in many years about 2/3 of the total acreage burned in the United States. So you could take all these big wildfires that you read about in the news, and prescribed fire still accounts for, 2020, 2019 was an exception, but and 2020. But basically, there's quite a lot of area that's burned in the United States, and in New Jersey as well. So this is just a map showing area burned in the Pine Barrens over a 10-year period. And you can see the landscape slowly fills in with quite a few burned areas. We burn about 25 to 30,000 acres a year in a combination of prescribed fire and wildfire. Some years it's more than that. Historically, so wrapping back around to the question, can restoration of fire-dependent ecosystems potentially reduce ticks? We compare our present day, or 2015, that's when I was working on some fire history work with my dissertation. 1915, we had about twice as much fire in the landscape annually as we do now. And that was nearly all wildfire. There was some prescribed fire going on at the time on a small scale around farms. But presently, we've got about half that gets burned, and the majority of that acreage is actually prescribed fire now. There's also a drive to increase prescribed burning nationally. It's a major focus of the USDA and the Forest Service right now. And in New Jersey and the Northeast, there's a lot of initiatives right now to also increase prescribed burning, particularly private land prescribed burning, and allowing land owners and private homeowners to treat their own properties. There's been legislation in New Jersey, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, I think maybe Maryland now too, and a number of other states to enable private land prescribed burning. And with that, we hope that the acreage in fire will increase. But let's just put those figures to some numbers from that last page there. So there's 1.4 million acres in the pinelands. 62% of that is upland forest, or about 860,000 acres. That's basically your burnable land. In 1915, about 65,000 acres burned annually. Most managers feel that fire effects last 4 to 8 years. So this would mean that at any given time, about that should be 260,000 to 560,000 acres of tick habitat would be considered treated during the historical periods, or about 30 to 60% of the landscape. If we assume a 50% reduction rate like we're seeing in our data right now, that would be about a 15 to 30% decrease in Lone Star ticks. And even though our numbers are small, just hypothetically speaking, we haven't seen any in burned areas. That would potentially mean 100% reduction of Ixodes scapularis on 30 to 60% of the landscape at any given time. So you can think about how, in today's world where we burn substantially less than that, we've actually ramped up compared to some intermediate decades where fire tapered off quite a bit in the 1970s and 80s, and now has been developing more as prescribed fire. How that might be pretty meaningful at a landscape scale, and particularly if more private landowners are able to manage their properties. The other point I want to make is that prescribed fire does and can happen around built areas. The Albany Pine Bush Preserve in Albany, New York is a great example of that. This preserve, here's a map of it on the right, is actually centered in the city of Albany between I-90 and Route 55 and I-87. It's got houses and shopping centers and these major roads near it, and they burn hundreds of acres a year without problem. In the Pine Barrens here, we burn quite a bit. We burn right up against retirement communities. This is an example of burning a YMCA camp, YMCA of the Pines. We burned around dozens of cabins and other structures on their site. And this is just an example in Florida of a burn that I was part of. Those two trees show up in the map on the right. That's pretty much how close to the building we were burning. So, it's not something that is without its dangers, but can be done safely and is done safely. With that, I guess I just want to also add that fire is obviously not the entire piece of the puzzle, but it does also impact wildlife, and wildlife populations have changed dramatically over the past 100 years, more than once. I'll point out the bobwhite quail, which in Florida is believed to eat a number of ticks. That used to be a common species in New Jersey that hasn't been for quite some time now, although there's efforts to reintroduce it. Some of these other wildlife populations have had major booms and busts over the years, and their behaviors are also impacted by fire, how they use different parts of the landscape and how much time they spend and what activities they're doing in different parts of the forest, depending on if they're burned or not. So I'll just thank the team again. As I said, Lexi, she's been, I couldn't have done this without her. She's been our technician for the past 2 years in the Pine Barrens and has helped with fire experiments and this project and LiDAR scanning. And she's going to be a PhD student in Rick Lathrop's lab starting in the fall. Julia is a Rutgers Camden undergraduate. She's been excellent also, and she's going on to do a PhD at Virginia Tech. after this year. And then I'd also like to thank Jesse, my partner at Penn State. Andrea has been an amazing help on this project. Jeremy from New Jersey Forest Fire Service, Jeremy Weber, is Assistant Division Warden in the Trenton office, who really helped us find sites and just helped us. Actually, they gave us a technician for a while as well. And then Nick Skronsky and Matt Patterson from the Forest Service Northern Research Station helped with sampling. I'd also like to thank our partners. All this work happened on a variety of different types of land. And so there was private land, nonprofit land, and state land involved. In particular, I'd really like to thank these 3 cranberry companies who let us do work on their properties: Quexon Cranberry Company, Lee Brothers Incorporated, and Moores Meadows. I'd also like to really thank the state for allowing us to use their land, and New Jersey Conservation Foundation and the New Jersey Natural Lands Trust. It might seem trivial, but the ability to do work on a site that's safe, that won't get vandalized, and you'd be surprised at what thing you could place in the woods and somebody will find it, surprisingly, and take it or throw it or break it. So these sites really allowed us to get this work done. With that, I'm 2 minutes ahead of schedule here, but I'd be happy to take some questions.
Thank you, Mike. Yeah, we have plenty of time for questions. Have any questions?
There are some questions already in the chat, so you may want to start by opening.
Sure. All right, let's go back to the top. Oh, Henry. Henry's wondering where the lizard is. That's an interesting point. We've seen I see a number of lizards that I work in the Pine Barrens. I was just talking to Tina about this, how there's a bit of a lack of work on how lizards might play into the tick interaction as well, including some things about parasitism of ticks on lizards. Henry and I have chatted about this before, but sometimes after fire, where you might not expect to see lizards as much, where it's open and dark, and some of these microclimate changes you'd think may have made the habitat less hospitable, I do seem to see quite a few lizards out there. Henry's asking for some information also about landmarks for that aerial. I'm going to try to get back to that slide just so you can see where our work happened. So
I think we can see the big sand mine right in the kind of almost the middle.
So for a frame of reference, all the way over on the right here, all the way over on the left, these 2 plots way out here, that's Medford, New Jersey. Okay. Over to the right, I'd say our northeastmost plot is Whiting, just south of the intersection of 559 and 70. Okay. And then the southernmost points are down at around Hog Wallow and Speedwell in Woodland Township, kind of near the Oswego research station, or the Mariucci Blueberry Cranberry Research Station.
So do you have the Franklin Parker Preserve in there?
Yeah, that's kind of right in the middle. There's a mix of sites right in the middle there. Okay. So yeah, Franklin Parker Preserve is in the middle. There's also the...
but you didn't go up as far as Collier's Mills in the Northeast.
No, that's your territory.
Okay.
No, it just was a little bit hard to get up there. This was a pretty big spread of sites. Just to drive between all the sites takes more than a day. Yeah. And so to do sampling, we had to split up into 3 different groups. And we subdivide these into 3 different routes. And we did them in different orders, but basically we tried to capture them in the same time period. So between about 8:30 in the morning and about noon or 12:30. Sometimes it pushed a little bit later. But every day, not only did we mix up the direction that we went in the plots, but we would do the rotation in a different direction so that we weren't sampling the same thing first every day and the same thing last every day.
May I ask you a question about the placement of your temperature sensors?
Yes.
So you were showing temperatures in high severity regions of 65 Celsius or something like that.
Yeah, that was
Which,
at
10 centimeters. So that's got to be including a lot of radiative thermal load from the ground, I would imagine, on a bright sunny day.
I guess it could be reflecting. We've seen some pretty, I had thermocouples out in some different plots at the research station. And there's a poster in my building. I may have taken it down. But we had some pretty fine thermocouples, and we saw some pretty similar numbers. It really tapers off once you get above about 10 centimeters, 10, 20 centimeters. But I just don't,
well,
I'm not disagreeing with you, but I think that it can get really hot down there.
It can, but I mean, even within the shot that you're showing there on the right of the screen, the surface temperatures, I'm sure, are 65 or 70 degrees Celsius, but in the shade of those little shrubs, it's probably 20 degrees or at least 15 degrees less than that.
Yeah.
And so my question was basically, are those temperatures that you're reporting, I mean, I can see their usefulness in terms of sort of qualitatively, but in terms of sort of close connections to the biophysical ecology in terms of fire or in terms of ticks, what would you say the significance of those temperatures might be? Where a tick, goes to the underside of a leaf and it's all of a sudden it's 15 degrees cooler than it was on the top of the leaf.
Right. So I think, my feeling about those measurements, and I guess I'd like to compare them also with we use other much more expensive temp RH sensors for some of our longer term measurements for different types of questions. And those sensors were big. They have solar shields. So you can see we built our own solar shields around the sensor. I'd like to compare at some point, just for a short period, to see how they track with, a more sophisticated temp RH sensor. But I think the idea is that right. So like, a tick maybe is getting chased around during the day by sunflex. And if you're a lizard, you can move pretty quickly and see where you're going to get out of the way. But, a tick might have to move a lot farther to find an area of moisture or reduced temperature in an environment like you see in the image on the right here with the flag versus the one where it's actually Mike Farrell measuring a tree on the left there, where there's just much more shade within their desired questing area.
Yeah, but I would actually argue, and I see Oliver already lift his head, so I'll let him talk first. Go for it, Oliver.
Hi, Mike. I just have a couple of questions. One is, are you planning on doing something similar in a habitat in which Ixodes scapularis is prevalent? And the second,
I would like to. I would like to. I'll also say that this project was done on a shoestring budget. Basically, it was Jesse and I were out at a fire meeting in Albuquerque in March of 2019, and we've been talking about doing something like this, and we decided to cut out of the meeting for 2 days, and we basically planned this out and came home and started it the next week or 2 weeks later. But we didn't. He had a little bit of startup funds that he was able to use for this, but yeah, we basically begged, borrowed, and stole from the other projects that we're working on. So that kind of constrained the scale.
Well, I'm saying that because Amblioma americanum is more adapted to drier and hotter habitats. So I think you will see a much better result or impact if you control habitats that retain more humidity, which is generally the habitats that Ixodes use. So I think you will have even a better result with if you do this in a habitat in which Ixodes is prevalent, just because Ixodes is more sensitive to changes in relative humidity and temperature.
Yeah.
And my second question is, a comment. It will be interesting to kind of, because you are seeing a reduction in tick population, but sometimes it's hard to address those reductions of ticks on how much is due to the intervention that you did. Sometimes it's hard to see, but it will be interesting maybe to put live ticks of each stage confined on treated and untreated plots to see their ability to survive over time. And that might give you a better idea of how effective your burns are on the long-term survival of these stages, even if they are brought up or introduced by animals, if they have a chance to survive or not in that environment.
Yeah, that's a really neat idea. I hadn't I hadn't thought about that, but that would be really neat. You know, especially to follow up on this and kind of compare, because you know it is difficult to it's difficult to know exactly what's going on, you know, through this process. That would be neat. You know, it'd also be neat. I don't know what the rules would be, but you know, you and I talked about you know, Ixodes scapularis and the Asian longhorn tick earlier, and I don't know if that would be if it would be a bad idea for some reasons if things got out, but it would be interesting to see if just introduce them in a controlled, contained environment and see how well they, you know, these ticks that we're not seeing, is it that they just can't survive these conditions, or is there some other factor that limits them?
Mike,
experimentally, that's going to be hard to do, to have enough ticks introduced that you then, I mean, yeah, good luck. But, I think it's a really interesting idea, but sample size is going to be a tricky one. Since I already passed on to Alvaro, Cesar, may I ask one question real quick? Which had to do with you mentioned that Andrea, and you were working on the pathogens, and you looked at Rickettsia amblyommatus. Has Andrea looked at Rickettsia rickettsii in your Amblyomma americanum?
Yeah.
Okay. Because you didn't mention it.
Yeah, let me just see. I'm at the wrong end of my presentation here.
You just have amblyommatus, and then you have Ehrlichia.
No, actually, I'm not sure. Maybe she didn't.
Okay, I'll have to ask. I'm confident that she probably did.
Yeah, maybe she didn't find it.
She probably didn't find it. So
I haven't talked
out there in the audience. So Andrew, if you're there, say something. But and welcome back. She's been back to work since yesterday. So yeah. So okay. So I was curious about, and then that question about doing in an area, these experiments in an area where you have ample. I know you said you thought you might have Ixodes scapularis in this area and were a little surprised by the fact that they weren't as common as you thought it would be. That was based on what?
Well, I mean, I got babesiosis not so long ago, I guess 2 years ago, and I remember the tick that bit me. I can tell you exactly where I was standing, probably within 5 feet when I got bitten by this tick, because it was surprising. But yeah, I've known a number of the forestry workers in the Pine Barrens. It seems like almost everyone I've known has gotten Lyme disease. Not to say that they've gotten it during their forestry work. A lot of folks who do agricultural work in the Pine Barrens end up getting, I don't think there's a strong number on it, and that's kind of an understudied thing too. But you know, I guess it seems I've seen them on myself before, and you know, it's just a question of where was I when I got them. And I think that's not always paying attention to. And, you know, but like I said, I got Rocky Mountain spotted fever and babesiosis at the same time. And that was fun.
You, by the way, you probably didn't have Rocky Mountain spotted fever.
No.
So, but anyway, so Andrea just said that she doesn't have a microphone, but she did test for other rickettsia.
Okay.
Did not find them. So,
yeah,
so that's what I suspected. So, and because this idea of Rocky Mountain spotted fever, rickettsiae, it's actually not as common, the pathogen itself, as we tend to think because of the serology. So again, the difference between, you know, tests on humans and then the presence on the ticks. But I just wanted to pass on. Oh, and then Dana, which for some reason, it's so people are kind of sending messages on the chat. But the point is that Andrea did not have a microphone, so I just wanted to pass on. And now Cesar had a question, so.
Well, I didn't have there's a couple of questions in the chat. John is asking, were deer numbers tallied in your study area? They
were not. We didn't do any kind of mammal surveys or tracking. We talked about it, and we just didn't have the manpower to pull it off, really. But that would be an excellent thing to look at. You know, anecdotally, as somebody who spends a lot of time has spent a lot of time in the forest and in different types of forest, burned and unburned. And also somebody that I hunt a little bit. There's definitely differences in how wildlife use different pieces of property and how much time they spend in those areas and what they're doing, whether they're moving through quickly or hanging out for a long period of time in groups that are definitely, I would say, dictated by the forest structure or the you know, conditions of the forest. There's another question here about using thermal imaging to get more detailed heat map. And that's also a really great idea. We did not do that, but we did do that in a separate study recently looking at bark on pitch pine trees. Totally different, but we used that, and we used photogrammetry to look at how bark flakes on pitch pines peel out over the course of a day as they dry. And warm, and how that basically predisposes those bark flakes to becoming embers during fires. So pitch pine bark flakes are the primary material that makes embers that turn into spot fires and light people's decks and roofs on fire when there are fires. And so there's, I guess, using thermal imagery is a really neat new tool that I'd like to embrace farther down the road.
Mike, can I ask a quick question? I've got to run to another session, but how lasting do you think the effect of fire on tick populations is? Part of the reason I ask is there have been a few studies, maybe one or two, on how fires affect chigger mite abundance, Trombicula. And I'm not sure I'd say any of those studies are definitive, but they suggest that within 2 to 3 years of a burn, chiggers are actually more abundant.
Yeah, so I think it depends on a couple things, but the short answer is in the Pine Barrens, I think it'll last for about 4, maybe to 8 years. And that's basically what most people in this forest type, that's about how long they feel like a prescribed fire treatment lasts for. And then really you've kind of lost the effect. So I would say by year 4, and maybe in some exceptional situations, maybe year 8, you know, maybe about that long. That's also about the desired fire return interval for managers.
So, I mean, ticks are definitely bigger than chiggers, but they're both pretty small compared to us. But that would suggest that there are pretty substantial differences in habitat use between chiggers and ticks. But I guess that's probably true even amongst species of ticks.
Well, I mean, we've only gone out 2 years so far in the study. So year 3, maybe we'll see, you you know, something more similar to what you're talking about. The other thing I'd just mention is that, you know, there's not that much research on fire and ticks. Maybe there's a little bit more on chigger mites, but there are some studies that say that have been shown to me, and like the same 2 or 3 studies that people lean on a lot, saying that fire makes ticks worse, or can make them worse, or doesn't do anything. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that those are not all the same environment type, that the conditions of the fire in those studies are not described at all, nor are the environmental conditions. And the studies that I'm thinking of have almost no little to no replication. You know, they're pretty old, and one of them, they basically went out and burned one site that they don't describe, and they found a bunch of ticks afterwards, and there's no description of like anything about it to really qualify it. So, you know, I think, yeah, I think in different environments, there's going to be different factors that are going to influence tick survival in general, and also their hosts, and how they're getting around, and just what the ambient conditions are. So I think, you know, I don't think anything's a silver bullet answer, but I think this definitely argues for some more exploration of it. And there's a woman, Elizabeth Gleam, who's done a couple studies down south that also have shown some similar results as we're finding in Georgia and Florida.
It's already
one last question, just
one last question, Dina. It's already noon. Okay.
Which is, and maybe I missed this, but I mean, burning versus just cutting the underbrush, or maybe doing both.
Yeah.
What's the downside to just cutting the underbrush?
Well,
expensive.
It takes a lot more money and a lot more effort to do it. You can treat a lot more land for a lot less money quickly with fire. You know, the expense to thin or cut even an acre is a whole lot. You know, it's fire's just way cheaper, and I guess arguably it might be. I mean, I don't agree with this completely, but I think for some people it might be more culturally acceptable than cutting trees. So you do get some pushback where people just you could burn it because fire is supposedly natural, but cutting a tree is not natural. And so, you know.
Okay, all right. I don't want to take time for your chat with the students, but okay.
That's
so the answer is money, culture, acceptance. You could do fire and then follow up with thinning, you know, especially close to homes and things like that.
Yeah, or vice versa. If you start with thinning, that can make burning a lot easier and even cheaper to do. And once you kind of establish that condition, it's easy to maintain it if the area hasn't been burned in a long time.
Got you. Thank you. Thanks. Great talk. I'll be talking to you.
Thank you.
Looking forward to it.
Thank you, Mike. So that
there were no invasive. There's Carl asked a question. There weren't any invasive plants in the understory. Sorry, Carol.
So yeah, we have to end now. But for the students taking the course, please stay on the call. And thank you.
Okay. How about
thank you. Thanks, everybody. Thank you very much.
Break. Mike, do you want to have a 10 minutes break?
Yeah, give me. I just want to eat my banana here, and then I'll be
we'll come back
good to go.
12:10.
Yeah,
okay.
10-minute break. That sounds
okay.
good.
Yeah, Mike, if you could unshare your screen.
Okay.
Share your screen.
Thanks, George.
Yep, no problem.
Thanks, everybody.
All right. Stop share. There we go. All right. All right. See you in a few.
It is hard, Chang-Lu, it's hard to like stop the questioning via Zoom. I'm noticing.